In the very first installment of Nightmare Masterclass, I covered This House Has People in It. Created by Alan Resnick and the comedy group Wham City, this surreal multimedia art project perplexed and horrified viewers with its surreal and non-linear manner of storytelling. It prompted me to go down a seemingly endless rabbit hole of additional material, a unique combination of the mundane, the darkly absurd, and indeed the horrific. Well, the Wham City crew is at it again, this time with a series of short videos on IFC called The Mirror. The Mirror is a series of 6 lessons, each taught by a man named Curtis. Ostensibly, Curtis is the leader of a religious movement called the Children of the Mirror. Throughout the lessons, Curtis prepares viewers for an event he refers to as the Return. But what exactly does this group believe? What is their motivation for creating these so-called lessons? What is going on beneath the surface of this abstract and unsettling video series? And just what the hell is a bone grenade? Stay tuned for my interpretation of The Mirror. Let's get into it. Curtis, the cult leader, is played by Robbie Radcliffe. Radcliffe is also the director of the series. You might recognize him from his previous role as Tom in This House Has People in It. I would venture to guess that while Alan Resnick was the prime mover of This House Has People in It, The Mirror is Radcliffe's baby. This is further evidenced by a certain Facebook post on Resnick's feed a while back. It reads, @Robbie Radcliffe had an idea. So we know that The Mirror is really the brainchild of Radcliffe. Clearly, all of the enterprises carried out by Wham City are highly collaborative efforts. But I get the sense that the creative folks over at Wham City take turns working on one another's ideas, which, by the way, I think is really cool. And whoever it is that has the initial idea is the person who takes the lead on the project. So, in this case, I suspect Radcliffe had an idea, and as such, he served as director for the project. Take note that Radcliffe is indeed listed as the creator. He and Dina Kellerman are credited with writing the series. This is important because I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between the respective styles of projects like unedited footage of a bear and This House Has People in It, projects that Resnick took the lead on, and The Mirror, evidently Radcliffe's conception. It's a nuanced distinction, but a distinction nonetheless. Primarily, I think the videos that encompass the entirety of The Mirror work together as a standalone piece. As far as I can tell, there isn't really any additional material, whereas with a project like This House Has People in It, supplemental text, images, audio, and video components not only enhance the piece, the considerable amount of supplemental material found on absurveillancesolutions.com was absolutely essential to the understanding of the piece. As far as I can tell, The Mirror doesn't work the same way. It's fairly self-contained. There are 6 lessons, and that's it. This is not a commentary on the quality, it's just an observation. And I could be totally off base here. It's possible that supplemental material exists for The Mirror, but if that's the case, it would appear that no one has found anything, save for one important exception that I'll talk about later. The point is, I think that The Mirror is a mostly self-contained work, and it's a weird one. Let's go over each of the group members briefly. Each of the subordinate group members gets their own profile section, playfully called Time Out with So-and-so. For instance, here's the Time Out with Reese.
I was in this band for a little while, and it was just me in the band. After the band broke up, we were like, oh, we should do like a performance. Anyway, that kind of evolved into this 12-volume script. So then I decided to make it like just a one-man play.
The timeout sections are styled in a confessional fashion, seemingly intended to give viewers some insight on what exactly each member is getting out of the Children of the Mirror experience. It somewhat operates in the way of a testimonial, or at least I think that was the intention. We are meant to be drawn in by the sense of community and fulfillment that each member exudes. But alas, each group member instead reveals some deep psychological dysfunction embedded in their own respective psyches. What we, the viewers, come away with is not a yearning to join this group, but rather an unsettling feeling that something is dreadfully wrong here. Reese, played by Ben O'Brien, is perhaps the most conspicuous member of the group. If these testimonials are meant to entice viewers into joining a group, it's a little strange that Reese's timeout is a total non sequitur. Here's something that might seem a little counterintuitive. As far as I can tell, Reese is a pretty intelligent guy. He fancies himself some kind of conceptual performance artist. He's talking about Christ allegories, and he has a detailed schematic for his next artistic piece. He's a bright guy. But if that's true, how did Reese get wrapped up in a group like this? Well, reading up on cults, I've come to the conclusion that it's somewhat of a misconception that people who get roped into abusive cults are not intelligent. Or at least, that shouldn't be automatically assumed about them. Really, the more intelligent a person is, the more well-equipped they are to defend their position, even despite how absurd that position may seem in the eyes of others. Motivated reasoning is an emotionally biased decision-making phenomenon studied in cognitive science and social psychology. It refers to the human tendency to frame new information in the context of an already held position. Someone applying motivated reasoning will favor information and evidence that supports their position, while vigorously downplaying and undermining evidence that works against it. Essentially, it's confirmation bias in action. So, in the case of a smart guy like Reese, he could be actively rationalizing his situation in a number of ways, merely because he wants to believe that Curtis is benevolent. He wants to believe that the group is pure and virtuous. And whenever he's exposed to information in the real world that may run contrary to the tenets of the Children of the Mirror, he's more than capable of using his reasoning skills to dispel such information. And I just want to take a second here to note the continual focus on the hands throughout the entire series. Indeed, even here in Reese's timeout, the camera continually tracks his hands as Reese explains his elaborate performance piece. We're going to touch on why there's such an emphasis on the hands throughout the series a little later. Keep it in mind. Let's talk about one of the group's most ardent supporters, a stone-faced woman named Fanny. Played brilliantly by Cricket Harrison, Fanny appears to have a rigid schedule as evidenced by her elaborate calendar in this clip.
Only the best of us here get Curtis to put on our shoes for us. It's a special honor, and he does it for one person every day. It's always been me, so I put the blue check marks next to myself. And then Curtis gets the blue check marks because he's Curtis. Reese gets the blue check marks because I put on his boots, which is almost as good, and some other people don't get them at all. Not even one.
At the very least, we know that she is an extremely ordered person, perhaps even to a compulsive degree. Fanny takes Curtis's teachings very seriously. Fanny is perhaps the most loyal devotee in the group. I'd venture to guess that she's looking for approval from an authority figure, and perhaps that's something she never experienced prior to getting wrapped up in this cult. And this is a theme we'll continually return to. Why are people drawn to these sorts of groups? As far as I can gather, there isn't a clear psychological profile for the type of person who joins a cult, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that troubled young people with difficult home situations are susceptible. Fanny provides a stark contrast to another character. Wesley, played by Alan Resnick, is a man that is not entirely serious as Fanny. Resnick has a history of portraying characters that are either mentally unstable or impaired in some way, and perhaps Wesley is a continuation of this pattern. He may even be developmentally impaired in some way akin to the character in Alan Tutorial. At the very least, Wesley's maturity level is stunted in some integral way. For instance, something doesn't seem quite right about him frolicking around the woods with Curtis. For some unknown reason, Fanny clearly resents Wesley. Based on the calendar that Fanny shows us, a certain someone never gets a check mark by his name. In fact, Wesley gets a big red X nearly every day, save for the final week of her schedule. I suspect that despite how devoted Fanny is to the children of the mirror, Curtis favors Wesley over her. Here we see Curtis accompanying Wesley on his whimsical forest excursion, and there's a look of amusement in Curtis's face. He enjoys Wesley's company, despite the notion that perhaps Wesley doesn't take things as seriously as Fanny. Naturally, this bothers her. It creates a competitive dynamic between the two. As we've discussed, each main character has a short profile segment called Time Out. Each character, that is, with the notable exception of Curtis, possibly just because he's the leader of the group. I'll give my thoughts on why he's excluded from the Time Out portion a little later on. For now, I just want to emphasize that this segment works to shed light on each of the characters' respective mentalities and, moreover, their working relationships with one another. It should be noted that there are additional group members who appear in subsequent lessons. They come and go in an unexplained fashion, almost at a comical pacing. It reminds me of the fictional metal band Spinal Tap, whose continual succession of drummers are all said to have died under strange circumstances. Well, in The Mirror, it is strongly implied at least one of these additional group members met with an untimely fate. We'll get into that later, too. At this point, it seems pertinent to do a brief overview of each lesson. But first, I just want to cover one major point on the format. Let's talk about the chronology of the videos. The series is divided up into 6 lessons, but the sequence of lessons jumps sporadically and without explanation. We have Lesson 5, Creativity, Lesson 8, Altruism, Lesson 13, Cleanliness, Lesson 28, Water, Lesson 56, Cleanliness 2, and lastly, Lesson 98, Interstellar Telepathic Communication. Are there lessons out there that we don't know about? Possibly, though as far as I can tell, no one has found anything worth mentioning. As with This House Has People in It, we're given an incomplete picture. We don't have access to all of the information, but we can discern a few things from the sequence itself. Namely, we can surmise that a good amount of time has passed between the lessons with the larger intervals between them. And we know that the intervals increase with each subsequent lesson. There are 3 intervals between lessons 5 and 8. There are 5 intervals between lessons 8 and 13. There are 15 intervals between lessons 13 and 28. There are 28 intervals between lessons 28 and 56. And finally, there are 42 intervals between lessons 56 and 98. What does this mean? Well, if we assume that the group has been making lessons at a regular pace, say a video every week, we can deduce that greater amounts of time have passed with each subsequent lesson. Now, that is a pretty big assumption, but there may be some evidence to indicate that the group would have this sort of discipline when it comes to making what essentially amounts to propaganda for their cult. It would appear as though Curtis runs a pretty tight ship. And as I pointed out previously, we know that Fanny keeps a pretty rigid schedule. Considering these 2 factors, I think it is reasonable to assume that each subsequent lesson takes place at increasingly longer intervals of time, considering how they are numbered. But why is that important? Bear with me here. The very first episode, dubbed Lesson 5, Creativity, provides an entry point for our discussion on the Children of the Mirror. Right off the bat, I should note that Curtis speaks almost exclusively in empty platitudes. For instance, he opens Lesson 5 by saying,
"The ability to be strong in the mind is key to living."
This is a phrase that sounds deep and philosophical, sort of like a Buddhist aphorism. In the context of what Curtis is saying, however, it is a notion used to exert control over the group. Curtis says,
"It's not just about being happy, it's about being protected. It's about being safe."
Curtis implies that there is great danger around every corner. He warns of an event called the Return, though we viewers are never given a clear picture of what such an event might entail, though historically, end-of-the-world scenarios tend to be the carrot on the proverbial stick for doomsday cults, and it's starting to look like the Children of the Mirror just might fit into that category. After he's through with this monologue, Curtis gestures towards a quaint and adorable little cross-stitch decoration, and every single thing he's just said is right there on the decoration. Curtis's rhetoric is scripted down to the very last word, and the real kicker is that he's not even hiding that fact. He is merely regurgitating the dogma of his cult, the Children of the Mirror. Curtis later says,
"Science has proven that creativity comes from the brain."
Of course, this is nothing more than a pseudoscientific word salad, and it should be obvious to anyone listening, though sadly, the statement is not terribly far off from the nonsensical, pseudoscientific garbage spewed by real-world charlatans.
You can begin right now to feel healthy. You can begin to feel prosperous. You can begin to feel the love that's surrounding you, even if it's not there. And what will happen is the universe will correspond to the nature of your song.
So does the thought create the molecule, or the molecule create the thought, or are they simultaneous expressions of a deeper, transcendent reality that we are inseparable?
Ironically, Curtis praises the virtues of building a strong mind, all the while his very ideology preys upon the naive and the vulnerable. Think about it. People like Wesley, Reese, and Fanny are prime targets for such artful chicanery. I would venture to guess that each of these characters have a plethora of emotional baggage. What makes a group like the Children of the Mirror appealing to these people? And in general, what makes certain people susceptible to cult mentality? Is it a yearning for something distinctly lacking in their own lives? I think it is, at least in part, the sense of family, and more broadly, the sense of community that comes along with living in a close-knit group. Unfortunately, the most vulnerable among us are the ones that fall victim to this sort of thing, and they are shamelessly exploited at every turn. The Children of the Mirror is no exception to this sad fact about life. Here, Curtis works to foster a sense of community through a certain activity, a craft that may leave you feeling a little troubled.
If you've been following along in the correct order of lessons, you'll recognize these.
So we can assume that at some point in the previous lessons, Curtis and the group obtain these bones. What type of bones are they? I'm no doctor, but a few of these bones appear to be eerily human-like. The bone grenades serve as ornaments in Curtis's bedroom. Additional pieces hang from the ceiling. The group is performing some kind of ritual. But what is the purpose? Let's briefly go over the mnemonic technique Curtis employs here. B. Begin with bones. O. Observe your options. N. Never forget your gloves. E. Everyone. G. Great time with bones. R. Really look at your bones. E. Everyone. N. Never forget your gloves. A. Avoid mistakes. D. Danger is everywhere. E. Everyone. Curtis has contrived a ritual to exert control over group members. Every component of the activity works towards this purpose. The acronym, while rife with various redundancies and inane filler words, works to drill certain insipid concepts into the heads of the group. Concepts that we'll later see are absolutely key to the doctrine of the Children of the Mirror. Never forget your gloves. Danger is everywhere. Avoid mistakes. I have a theory about the bones, and by no means is it an optimistic appraisal of the situation. The bones are from group members that have been murdered by Curtis, or perhaps other members of the group under the direction of Curtis. They are a reminder to surviving members like Wesley, Reese, and Fanny of what happens to those who dare to step out of line. In consideration of this theory, the fact that Curtis has the other members decorate his bedroom with the ornaments becomes all the more disturbing. Curtis is shrouded by the bones of his victims. He is emboldened by them. Let's review Lesson 8 on the subject of altruism.
Hello, children. Are you hungry? I'm not. I have more than enough to eat. More than enough to sustain me, if I were the old me. By which, of course, I mean the old new me, since the old me inhabited a form that can't be described in a language humans can hear. But I'm not the old me, nor am I the old new me. Because if I was, I'd eat up all this food myself. I'm the new me. I'm the new me.
Okay, let's break this down. Note that Curtis's notion of altruism is not entirely selfless. It's actually an elaborate ruse. Nothing is as it seems in this group. In biological terms, altruism is defined as the behavior of an animal that benefits another at its own expense. That last part is important. The cornucopia is a symbol of abundance and nourishment. It logically follows that if one is living in true abundance, sparing some food is not strictly a selfless behavior, especially if you're expecting something in return. After all, if you have more than enough food, a veritable cornucopia, it's not really some grand gesture to allow others to partake, especially if there are strings attached to your gift. On some level, I think the viewer is meant to recognize this conceptual dissonance. Like many other aspects of the piece, it's meant to make the audience feel an unsettling sense that something is terribly off with these so-called lessons. I think Curtis's notion of the new me is also a total ruse designed to give prospective cult members hope at the possibility of a new identity. We've all made mistakes in the past. Wouldn't it be great to start fresh with an entire new outlook on life? Curtis, whether unwittingly or with purposeful malice, veils his ruse with convoluted terminology so as to obscure the fact that it's all an elaborate con, an ideology without any concrete foundation, a house of cards. All this talk of the old new me and the old me and indeed the new me work towards this purpose. It is arbitrarily complicated so as to hide the fact that ultimately there is no real substance to his ideology. Moreover, Curtis notes that the old me can't be described in a language that humans can hear. And I would venture to guess that any time Curtis is asked a specific question about this doctrine, anytime a member dares to ask for concrete evidence of what Curtis is claiming, he'll inevitably defer to this position. It's not for you to understand. It's not spoken in a language human ears can sense. How convenient. This is, of course, a complete and total dodge. And again, note the continual emphasis on the hands, and also take note of the fact that throughout this entire series, various members appear glistening with sweat, an indication that they are under intense stress. You have to keep in mind that these lessons are all construction. They're pieces of propaganda created by a group looking to indoctrinate viewers. As such, we're getting a warped perspective right off the bat. The group isn't living in true abundance. Their cornucopia is plastic. It's a prop. It's all fake. So too is this sense of family and community fostered by Curtis. As we'll see, his love is not unconditional. It requires total compliance to the tenets of the children of the mirror. And when compliance isn't strictly upheld, bad things happen. Let's review Lesson 13, Cleanliness. There is a distinct emphasis on corners and angles in this lesson. One clever Redditor pointed out Curtis's use of the term Tindalos doorways in reference to corners. This is an explicit reference to the Hounds of Tindalos, fictional creatures created by Frank Belknap Long and incorporated into H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos in the early 20th century. Notably, the Hounds of Tindalos are said to inhabit the angles of time, while humans and other biological life on Earth descend from curves. The hounds prey on humans and can materialize through any relatively sharp corner. Don't ask me why the angle of the corner matters. It's made up. So obviously, this is a parallel worth noting. I should also point out that Robbie Radcliffe appears to be an avid gamer and a known fan of the Final Fantasy franchise. We know that as of December 16, 2014, He played through the entirety of Final Fantasy VII, and here's a recent tweet from Radcliffe. Final Fantasy 15 is the most upsetting game I have ever played. Well, the hounds, referred to as Tindalos, are a minor enemy in the game Final Fantasy X2, a game that I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Radcliffe is familiar with. So Curtis's use of the term Tindalos doorways could just be an Easter egg. It could be something to entice fans of H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos. But perhaps it is even reasonable to say that the Children of the Mirror have based their own mythology on the writings of Lovecraft. Indeed, later in the progression of the story, Curtis makes veiled references to the shit of beings you cannot even imagine enough to fear. That strikes me as a rather clear Lovecraftian notion. Ultimately, though, I think it is important to keep in mind that the theology of the Children of the Mirror isn't necessarily what's important. We could spend hours dissecting each of Curtis's various and jumbled parables, and indeed extract all of the potential references, be they literary or otherwise. Or we can pay attention to what's actually happening in the video. And that's something that I think supersedes the importance of pop culture references. In Lesson 28, Water, Curtis directly addresses viewers who have yet to join the Children of the Mirror. He implores us to consider those around us who are ignoring the evidence that catastrophic change is occurring. And then he takes a nice long sip of water, all the while staring intently into the camera. What exactly is Curtis referring to? We never really get any specifics, but he does emphasize that the world is a dangerous place, and it is important to recognize that primarily fear is how Curtis maintains influence over other members in the group. Curtis and the group then proceed to do an exercise of sorts, and this exercise will serve to demonstrate another way Curtis maintains control over his subordinates.
Fanny! Walk towards me as if you are ignorant of me. Hello, miss.
Hello.
So as you can see, that's a best case scenario.
So it would appear that this demonstration is successful, though we're never really clued into what Curtis is trying to demonstrate. But then take a look at this.
Wesley, why don't you try?
Hello.
Absolutely not. Wesley, please try not to waste my time and the time of everyone else around you. Let's try something else.
Okay, so what did we just witness? I don't know about you, but as far as I can tell, Wesley performed the exact same task as Fanny. He walked up to Curtis and said, "Hello." And yet, Curtis considers Wesley's performance a failure, while Fanny's performance is considered a, quote, best case scenario. This is an example of what I would call gaslighting. It's a form of emotional abuse. Wesley did absolutely nothing wrong. He is fully complying with Curtis's wishes, and yet he's made to suffer. Why? Well, Curtis benefits from this dynamic in a number of ways. Again, he's creating a competitive relationship between Wesley and Fanny. In this case, it is a form of positive reinforcement for Fanny, a person that clearly craves this kind of approval, and it makes Wesley question his own sanity, which from Curtis's perspective is a fairly useful state for him to be in, considering, he's in a cult. If you've bought into the ideology of the group at this point, you'll be under the impression that Curtis has access to the hidden truths of the universe. And if you really believe that, then his reprimanding of Wesley will not only seem reasonable, it will seem totally necessary for the purposes of the group's well-being. If Curtis is the one with access to the secret meaning behind reality, then it's not your place as a subordinate to question that. It's your place to accept it and hope that you can make progress towards understanding his teachings. So these means by which Curtis manipulates the group might seem peculiar and even comical to an outsider, but nonetheless, they're effective. Some of this emotional abuse is subtle, and some of it is not so subtle, but you have to keep in mind that Curtis carries on this way to reinforce the power dynamic that he's established. Let's talk about another certain peculiar ritual performed by the so-called Children of the Mirror. Many of the lessons are given epilogues, filled with what I would refer to as word salad.
Everything boils, everything bleeds. And that's why it's important to have at least one wet vac in the house. But everything becomes dust. And from dust we find that in the dust are entire worlds where anything can happen.
There are many signs of Curtis's truth. I want to scream at my friends. It is okay to want to scream at my friends. I have to do whatever it takes to reach them.
Word salad is an actual term used in psychiatry. It is defined as, quote, a confused or unintelligible mixture of seemingly random words and phrases, specifically in psychiatry as a form of speech indicative of advanced schizophrenia. This definition notes that use of word salad is indicative of a mental disorder, specifically advanced schizophrenia. Of course, I should note here that I am not a mental health professional. However, just from a layman's perspective, I'd say that the cult-like mentality exhibited by this group is not that far off from some kind of shared mental illness. Would it be a stretch to say that Curtis, Wesley, Fanny, and Reese all share the same absurd delusional beliefs? Is it merely a coincidence that the group's salute involves all the members holding their hands over their eyes, effectively blinding them? I think not. I think this is meant to be symbolic. More on that later. Let's move on to Lesson 56, aptly dubbed Cleanliness 2. So, remember when I made a big deal about the chronology? You know, the idea that each of the subsequent lessons takes place at increasingly longer intervals of time? I think that is significant because, to me, it is an anomaly that represents lost time. When a person undergoes traumatic experiences, which are common in cult settings, that person will often block out the experience entirely in order to deal with the pain. This is called dissociative amnesia. The Merck Manual defines dissociative amnesia as an inability to recall important personal information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, that is too extensive to be explained by normal forgetfulness. Think of it like a coping mechanism. The pain of the experience is so horrible that the brain effectively just blocks it out of conscious thought. There is a structural sort of parallel happening here in the mirror. The order of lessons jumps forward wildly with each subsequent lesson. To me, this is an indication that group members are undergoing a sizable amount of trauma, both psychologically and perhaps even physically. Consider the gaps between lessons like a series of fugue states. We, the viewers, are not allowed to access these memories. They have been repressed. This lesson sets itself apart from previous lessons, primarily in tone. Clearly, the set that day was tense. Curtis is fuming. He scrubs his hands furiously. And if you're wondering why someone would scrub their gloved hands, it's beyond me. But it would suffice to say that someone, it's not clear who exactly, explicitly violated the tenets of the Children of the Mirror, at least according to Curtis. He explains that someone in the group has not been taking the lessons seriously. And then we get a quick jump to this shot. It would appear to be an open door in the corner. It leads to some kind of closet. So what has happened here? There is some kind of stain on the ground. It might be a burn mark. I'm not sure. My mind immediately jumps to blood because, well, this story seems to be taking a very dark turn. As I've previously established, Curtis maintains control over these people by continually instilling fear. If all of the appropriate protocols are not followed to the smallest detail, it undermines Curtis's authority, and that is simply unacceptable in his mind. It makes sense that Curtis would react this way in response to a breach of protocol. What doesn't make sense is the weird stuff going on with the footage itself. Here we have Curtis, and he looks relatively normal. Well, in the very next frame, his face is totally red. Same deal with Fanny. Her face looks totally normal here, and then one frame later, yikes. So how do we make sense of that? As with This House Has People in It, I will again introduce the idea that we are looking into a world that operates a little differently than our own. I think that, as with This House Has People in It, the setting of the mirror is a reality in which beliefs manifest into real physical anomalies. Curtis's face instantly turning red at the idea of a violation of the tenets of his ideology is just one example. We'll get into this a little more later. But I want you to notice the gradual progression of this series as it comes to its conclusion into surreal, unexplainable, and unsettling imagery. The group's shared delusion is causing reality itself to warp. I believe it represents the group's dissolution, as well as Curtis's gradual mental decline. Here's a question worth asking at this point. What's happened to all of the group members that have appeared in previous lessons? We don't know. Some of them could have escaped, some of them could have been killed. Note that this is the first lesson that doesn't contain an extra group member. Note that Curtis has a mark where one of his friendship bracelets used to be. I would venture to guess someone has been killed, and the appropriate protocols haven't been followed to Curtis's satisfaction. Hence the outburst here. Let's move on to the final episode, Lesson 98, Interstellar Telepathic Communication. It's important to note that each lesson deals with a different concept. They start off rather simple. Lesson 5 covers creativity, Lesson 8 covers altruism, Lesson 13 covers cleanliness, Lesson 28 covers water, Lesson 56 covers cleanliness again, and finally, Lesson 98 covers interstellar telepathic communication. So, right away we can observe that one of these things is not like the others, and that's the joke. Lesson 98 takes place at a time interval that is further apart than any other lesson, and conceptually, it covers an idea that is so abstract and removed from the rest of the lessons, so as to be almost comical. I think this is thematically significant for a number of reasons. It is a commentary on how cults gradually convince their members of notions that are patently absurd. And here's another confounding element to the title of this episode. If you perform a Google search on the term interstellar telepathic communication, you will receive some intriguing results. It is, after all, an oddly specific term. One such result led me to a website called the Golden Planet Forum, a message board dedicated to something called the Thayauba Prophecy, She and I and Other Books by Michel Desmarquet. The thread found in the search results is from way back in 2008. It's a question. Hello. In TP, it says that one purpose of the pyramids was interstellar telepathic communication because telepathy is not possible over vast distances. What worries me about this is why would something non-linear, telepathy, depend on something linear, distance? Any thoughts? The responses are, well, let's just say they're interesting.
Quantum entanglement, most likely. Even in the world of quantum mechanics, there will be laws or general rules that need bending. The solar system may function as a hub, not to allow too much out of its own backyard. It's a bit like shouting at the town down the road in the vain hope they hear you. The sound would be soaked up in background noise, so stronger forms of communication is needed. I thought this as well, a bit off topic, but how did the Galactic Comm Center Thau's people talk to Michelle on? How far away from Theuba were they when they transmitted this? I might guess technology also. It may be possible to communicate over vast distances in space. Of course, it would be way beyond our technology.
Had I not looked into this further, I would think this website is a joke, or perhaps some kind of sci-fi fantasy role-playing forum. It's not. It's a real website with genuine proponents of something called the Thayauba Prophecy. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Interestingly, there is a clear parallel between Curtis's final lesson and a presentation given by Michel Desmarquet, again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, of the Thayauba Prophecy.
And my name is Michel Desmarquet. Certain of you saw me, certain never seen before. Now, for those who haven't read the book at all, how many of you didn't read the book? Yeah, good, few. Okay, so I have to start from the beginning, which was during the night. I was sleeping very quietly in my little hobby farm over there in North Queensland, when suddenly I wake and I was thinking it was a morning book. At that moment I became like a zombie in my own house, like if I was telepatized by something, hypnotized.
I have absolutely no idea what to make of this, but let me tell you, this is a whole other rabbit hole in and of itself. It would suffice to say that I think the children of the mirror are inspired, at least in part, by the Thioba prophecy. I think Radcliffe intentionally used the term interstellar telepathic communication to lead us to this bizarre corner of the internet. I think we're meant to realize that the mirror, while clearly a bit hyperbolic, is not that far off from what occurs in the real world. The idea that there's a cult that makes, quote, bone grenades and keeps a schedule of when the leader puts certain members' boots on is, on its surface, an absurd and hilarious idea. But conversely, it's truly disturbing to think there are people like this in the real world. Onto the content of the lesson. Lesson 98 is notably more amateurish than the previous videos. For some unexplained reason, Curtis no longer has the means available to edit his videos together. Instead, he is limited to only what he can do on camera. He plays the familiar lesson theme song on his stereo. It is a haphazard production relative to his previous lessons. He holds up a sign that says, Lesson 98, Interstellar Telepathic Communication. There are no other group members present. A number of jars, glasses, and jugs rest ominously on Curtis's desk. Curtis starts off the video by thanking those who remain loyal to his cause. He acknowledges that certain group members have been lost. And take note, there appears to be a shrine in the left-hand corner complete with a shirt from one of the group members. It's lit up with two seemingly identical light bulbs on each side. It is perhaps a tribute to one of Curtis's fallen comrades. Under his yellow raincoat is a black mesh vest with various colored markers attached. There's also what appears to be a water bottle in one of his pockets. Curtis gets up and changes locations. He's now in a room with an overhead projector. There's a jug containing some kind of liquid on the table in front of Curtis. Later on, Curtis can be seen drinking from said jug. We can also see a stack of sliced bread accompanying the jug. Curtis displays a shoddily drawn rendering of planet Earth. Note that it is not perfectly circular, but rather more of an oval shape. He then shows a facile rendering of the universe. He says that our planet is a plate and that the universe is a table. Then he poses a series of leading questions. What happens when the plate reaches the end of the table? What's underneath the table? Who made the table? Things get a little chaotic from this point onwards. Curtis starts ranting like a maniac, and the footage starts getting distorted. A few frames show Curtis's display with H2O written on the screen. There are additional quick shots of the words crazy and possibly leak on the display. Curtis grabs a camera, wraps a clear plastic tarp over himself, and appears to venture outside. He makes his way out to the street, appears to turn around and come back in the direction he came from, only to be faced with himself. Cut to the empty projector room. And cut to Curtis's office. The nameplate on the desk reads, When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That's it. That is the end. Okay, so what just happened? There are a few ways to go with this, but first, do you remember how I pointed out that we never see a timeout profile for Curtis, the man himself? Up until this point, we, the viewers, are never given any real insight about his personal motivation for starting the Children of the Mirror. Well, let me point out that this final lesson, in its entirety, effectively serves as the ultimate timeout segment for Curtis. Yeah, okay. So it is here, at this point in the story, where we see Curtis's true nature. The facade has been worn away, and what is revealed is a solitary man who has succumbed to his own delusions. He's been isolated by the very ideology he worked to perpetuate. Remember when I said there was no additional material in the mirror? Well, it turns out that is not entirely true. There is one short video that played for a time on Wham City's website. It is uploaded on YouTube under Alan Resnick's account. The link is not publicly known, but luckily, someone on Reddit found it. Let's take a look. It's just a person moving a pen from the left to the right of a notepad. Nothing much else is going on here. But take note of the video's title, Mirror Background. Not background, background. There's no G. Got it? And wait a minute. Let's go back to the video. The pen moves from the left to the right, and it does so in an intentional sort of way. I think it's Morse code. Morse code transmits information by using a series of on-off tones, or clicks. The code is made up of standardized sequences called dots and dashes. A dot is a short tone, and a dash is a long one. For example, the standard emergency signal is SOS, and it sounds like this. But in this video, information isn't being transmitted audibly. It's being done in a visual fashion. I think the left represents a dot, since that's where the pen starts, and the right represents a dash. If you watch the video in its entirety and you follow the pattern, here's what it spells out. R, E, E, C, E, E, C, E, E, R. So that's Reese's name, and then the complete reverse of his name. Almost like a mirror image. What does that mean exactly? Is it just an Easter egg? I don't think so. Reese might actually be the key to everything. Here's where things are going to get weird. Remember Reese's drawing? In Reese's timeout section, he showed us an idea that he had sketched out. Let's take a look at what he's jotted down on that notebook paper. It appears to be some sort of schematic, complete with dimensions, and what I assume are stage directions taking a circular movement around some kind of structure. And though it appears to have been hastily jotted down on a solitary piece of notebook paper, this schematic just may be the key to the entire story. For your reference, I've traced over this sketch to better illuminate what it depicts. Unfortunately, I was unable to discern the specific dimensions or what any of the actual writing says, but I was able to depict the basic shapes. Reese claims to have been in a band, one which evolved into some kind of performance piece, a 12-volume script which he then decided to make into a one-man play. He describes it as a Christ allegory. He then begins to trail off about some kind of magic trick, maybe performed at great heights, a disappearing act of sorts, though he emphasizes that there's not going to be a, quote, poof. He expresses interest in doing the play entirely in the dark. Does that sound familiar at all? Well, okay, let's start with the 12-volume Christ allegory. If you know anything about the story of Jesus, you know that there were 12 apostles. So it can be reasonably assumed that in Reese's Christ allegory, he had a volume for each apostle. Makes sense, right? So in the mirror, there are 6 lessons. Lesson 5 features a timeout for Reese. Lesson 8 has a timeout with Fanny. Lesson 13 has a timeout with Wesley. And then things sort of get off track. In lesson 28, a 4th group member runs away. Do you see where I'm going with this? This is not the story of Jesus Christ. This is not a Christ allegory. On the contrary, it's actually quite the opposite. It is the story of a false prophet who leads his flock astray and is likely responsible for their collective demise. In lesson 56, Curtis is shown emotionally abusing his subordinates. He admonishes them. He screams in their faces. And in the very next lesson, his flock is gone. Take a wild fucking guess what happened to them. Okay, let's take a look at that rendering again. Now, if you recall, the video that sent us to Reese's timeout had a peculiar name, Mirror Back Round. Reese's allegory ends with a sort of magic trick, one that takes place entirely in the dark. Does that sound familiar at all? The final sequence depicts Curtis putting a plastic tarp over his head and going out into the darkness. The camera even switches to night vision. The entirety of the final sequence takes place in total darkness. Curtis runs down an alleyway, turns around, and comes back only to find a mirror image of himself waiting. Reese's 12-volume Christ allegory essentially predicts the ending of this series. Is he breaking the fourth wall when he tells us about this idea? It's hard to say. The mirror, the piece itself, is calling attention to Reese. We are directed to his timeout from a clue in the Mirror Background video. Reese could be an unwitting player in all this. His project serves as a foreshadowing element of the plot, though the character himself doesn't appear to be aware of this, at least not explicitly. But then again, look at his expression in the intro. In hindsight, that's a little ominous, isn't it? Is that a knowing smile? Maybe Reese knows something we don't. I think the character Reese is a meta-commentary on the creators of The Mirror. That is to say that Reese is a parodic, exaggerated, and fictionalized version of the creators themselves. To me, it's Radcliffe and Wham City saying to the viewers, look, see, we're not above this. Reese is susceptible to the cult mentality too. We all are. I'm thinking that some kind of murder-suicide situation happened prior to the shooting of this final lesson. Perhaps Curtis regrets some of his actions. There is a hint of resignation in his voice. He's created a shrine to honor one of the group members. I would venture to guess that Curtis took actions which, in his mind, served to further the cause of the children of the Mirror. And in doing so, he ended the lives of his disciples. Or perhaps he coerced them into ending their own lives, just as Jim Jones of the People's Temple did back in 1978. We previously observed the numerous jars and jugs throughout Curtis's office area. Perhaps these jugs are filled with the very poisonous chemicals he used to commit these truly unspeakable acts. Or maybe it's just water. After all, Curtis clearly has an obsession with water. That is the optimistic interpretation. However, based on the final moments of the series, I just don't think that's the case. In This House Has People in It, the family believed in Lynch disease so much it became real to them, and the general community at large. Similarly, I think by the end of this video series, Curtis has fully bought into his own ideology. He's on the throes of total insanity. See, Curtis didn't fall victim to the hounds of Tindalos. These things were never the true threat. The only villain in this story is Curtis. He continually abused his subordinates. He worked to indoctrinate them into a fear-based ideology, and let's face it, he's very likely responsible for their deaths. And he is made to confront that sad truth. Reality in the Mirror operates in the same fashion as This House Has People in It. The logic of the universe is the same as This House Has People in It. Beliefs can manifest into real physical beings. Whereas with This House Has People in It, the family's belief in Lynch disease, their collective anxiety around the disease, manifested into a creature known as the family friend. In The Mirror, Curtis's belief in the tenets of his faith manifests into his doppelganger at the end of the series. As such, Curtis comes face to face with the murderer that he's become. We can call this beast the, quote, new me, or the old new me, or whatever really. Whatever you want to call it, we're seeing the fully actualized version of Curtis, the abusive, unhinged cult leader. It is the logical extension of his identity, a hellish mirror image. And unfortunately for Curtis, that person is more than willing to take another life, his own. That is what I think happens when the screen goes dark. Like so many other cult leaders of times past, Curtis effectively commits suicide at the end of this series. What do we make of The Mirror? How can we make sense of this enigmatic video series? It is obvious to me that a great deal of thought went into the making of this. In my previous video on This House Has People in It, I noted the tragic incident at Jonestown. Through mere persuasion, Jim Jones coerced people into committing suicide, and moreover, murdering their own children. He created an elaborate mythology that was so real to his followers, they were willing to give up their lives as testament to its veracity. This is something that I believe Curtis is emulating, whether consciously or otherwise. The central icon of the group is a pair of hands locked together in a specific manner as such. The group members habitually hold their hands over their faces in this fashion. As previously discussed, it's their way of saluting one another. But it's more than just a salute. Remember when I mentioned the continual emphasis on hands throughout this series? When you consider the fact that the group's icon is a pair of hands covering the face, specifically the eyes, it all begins to take shape as a multifaceted sort of metaphor. Each time a group member's hands are emphasized on camera, they are expressing an idea or belief. I think that hands represent beliefs in this series. The group's belief system effectively blinds them from a number of things, not the least of which would be the harmful dynamic between the group and its leader, Curtis. Thematically, holding one's hands over their eyes is a symbol that, to me, represents a kind of willful blindness about the world. The group shrouds themselves in their absurd ideology, using it to shield themselves from the inconvenient and uncomfortable truths of the world. They hold a worldview that insulates them from the outside world altogether. At this point, it makes sense to me to explore what exactly constitutes a cult, because the term is somewhat nebulous. Historically, the word cult has been used to unfairly sublimate religious or political movements. Indeed, a number of abuses have been committed in the name of combating so-called cult movements. So we have to be careful not to paint with a broad brush here. There are plenty of relatively innocuous, close-knit religious communities that we might be tempted to refer to as cults, but lack certain qualities apparent in the abuse-laden groups we've come to associate with the word. Due to its pejorative nature, some academics have discouraged use of the term altogether in favor of the more even-handed term, new religious movement. Though I personally feel there is a useful distinction that needs to be made here, based on the fact that some of these groups are indeed harmful. We can use the fictional Children of the Mirror as a template for cult mentality. Clearly, this is not your run-of-the-mill religious group. They are militant, they are organized, and their leader is an abusive maniac. Let's attempt to unpack the group's mythology. Curtis refers to an event called the Return. At least one component of the ideology of the Children of the Mirror seems to be preparing for this momentous occasion. And while we're not given many details about this ominous-sounding future occurrence, it is not a huge stretch of reason to make certain associations with real-world doomsday cults. Such groups typically base their ideology around an apocalyptic event, which they work in preparation of, or even attempt to bring about. For instance, Heaven's Gate was a group of people who believed that the earth was about to be, quote, recycled, and their only chance for survival was to leave the planet. The parallels between the Children of the Mirror and Heaven's Gate are incontrovertible. The group was founded by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, referred to as T and Doe. They combined Christian mythology, New Age spirituality, and science fiction to entice prospective followers. And they were successful in that regard. Followers were led to believe that the man they referred to as Doe was indeed the return of Jesus Christ himself. Moreover, they believed a group of malevolent aliens called Luciferians were working to corrupt all existing religions on the planet. Not surprisingly, this situation didn't end well. In 1997, the group committed mass suicide so as to, quote, evacuate the earth in preparation of the apocalypse. They took a drug called phenobarbital, which was mixed with applesauce and washed down with vodka. 39 group members died. In principle, the group claimed to be against suicide, though they defined suicide as the rejection of the offer to transcend to the next level. Similar to the Children of the Mirror, the group created video entries, most notably the videos depicting their thought process prior to ending their own lives.
We don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know how much longer this civilization is even going to continue on. And so all this may be mute, but whatever time it's worth, that's why we're saying these things.
I mean, we're sorry to say that there are many that were with us that chose to give up an eternity of service with their Creator, closeness, and an opportunity to be the fullest, to reach the fullest potential that their Creator imagined for them, and they gave it up for a few months or years of closeness to another human.
It's difficult to know that, but for those that we've left behind, we're going on to something greater and better, and that we hope that someday you will understand this and you might join us.
I'd like to propose an idea. The events in the mirror occur in the same conceptual universe as This House Has People in It. Let's call it the Whamverse. It's just something that I want to put out there, if only due to the fact that it makes a startling amount of sense. It may or may not be the intentions of the creators. I don't know. I don't think their intentions necessarily matter. I don't mean to say that they literally take place in the same continuity, although they could. But at the very least, the events occur in the same general thematic universe. In other words, I think the mirror is working towards the same thing as This House Has People in It. It is exploring the manner in which toxic ideologies spread and evolve. Author David Foster Wallace once attempted to unpack the term Lynchian, i.e. the style of director David Lynch.
There's a part in the essay that kind of does this academic, let's unpack the idea of Lynchian, and what Lynchian means is something about the unbelievably grotesque existing in a kind of union with the unbelievably banal. I guess the big one is, a regular domestic murder is not Lynchian, but if the man, if the police come to the scene and see the man standing over the body, and the woman, let's say the woman's 50s bouffant is undisturbed, and the man and the cops have this conversation about the fact that the man killed the woman because she persistently refused to buy, say for instance, Jif peanut butter rather than Skippy, and how very, very important that is. And if the cops found themselves somehow agreeing that there were major differences between the brands, and that a wife who didn't recognize those differences was deficient in her wifely duties, that would be Lynchian. This weird confluence of very dark, surreal, violent stuff and absolute, almost Norman Rockwell, banal American stuff, which is terrain he's been working for quite a while.
Wallace noted that the true mark of a Lynchian work is the absurd juxtaposition between the mundane and the truly horrific. Certain elements of previous Wham City products have been called Lynchian. In my analysis of This House Has People in It, I noted that the pink nightmarish creature, i.e. the family friend, was reminiscent of the vagrant from Mulholland Drive. With its combination of the domestic and the darkly surreal, This House Has People in It was distinctly Lynchian. That is again the case here with the mirror. But it is something else too. It works towards something. I am not a proponent of the idea that artistic works can be understood outside of the relative context of times and culture in which they were born. On the contrary, I think art is necessarily an abstract reflection on the society in which it was created. As such, I've cited a few real-world examples to illustrate what exactly the mirror is commenting on. The mirror is a parody of cults. It demonstrates, pretty aptly I might add, the absurd nature of cult mentality, and more broadly, the tragic plasticity of the human mind. We are, all of us in our own way, lemmings. The real trick is realizing that human nature is fraught with problematic tendencies towards bias, towards prejudice, towards fallacious reasoning, and towards magical thinking. We're all tragically flawed in this way, and to think you're above it is only to immerse yourself further in delusion. Skepticism is the only way to move forward with any sense of intellectual honesty. But you also have to be skeptical of your own belief system. It's not easy, but I think it's worth it. Anytime you feel yourself getting carried away with any particular idea, whether it's political or religious or whatever really, take the time to try and reassess what it is you're holding on to. You might find out that it's not as concrete as you originally thought. Take care to question your ideology at every step. If you don't, you might as well be in a cult. I don't pretend to have all the answers. What I do is I look at the evidence that is available to me, and at the end of the day, I try to make an assessment. But still, I'm always open to the idea that I'm totally wrong. And that, I think, is the key to the mirror. If new evidence emerges, and it runs counter to any one of my inane theories, well then, maybe it's time for me to rethink things. The same goes for anything else in life. That is the absolute best anyone can do. I know I'm probably missing a few things in the mirror. I know I've probably missed a few things in my previous videos. Let me know. Please share your ideas in the comments. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Unfortunately, our next episode will not air, and in its stead will be a full hour of complete and total silence. Join us next time, and thank you for watching.